Imagine a winter so brutal, it redefines the very meaning of isolation. A blizzard so relentless it doesn't just block roads, it erases them. It doesn't just cut power, it cuts you off from the entire world, leaving you utterly alone, with nothing but the chilling whisper of the wind and the secrets buried deep beneath the snow. This story contains themes of psychological distress, extreme isolation, and unsettling events. Listener discretion is advised. What if that storm didn't just bury a town in snow, but buried its darkest secrets, along with its people? What if the real terror wasn't the cold, but what the cold allowed to happen unseen, unheard, beneath a suffocating blanket of white? This is the story of Oakhaven, a town that vanished not into thin air, but into the heart of a winter so profound, it became an accomplice to a mystery that still haunts those who dare to speak its name. Oakhaven was one of those places you only found if you were looking for it, and even then you might miss the turn. Tucked deep into a forgotten fold of the Appalachian Mountains, it was a postcard from a bygone era. A single general store, run by old Martha Jenkins, who knew everyone's business and baked the best apple pies this side of the Mississippi. A tiny post office, a gas station that sold more fishing lures than fuel, and a church with a steeple that seemed to touch the low-hanging clouds. The entire town population barely scraped 200 souls, all of them connected by generations of shared history, interwoven families, and a quiet, fierce independence. Life in Oakhaven moved at a different pace. It was a rhythm dictated by the seasons, by the rising and setting of the sun over the ancient peaks, by the harvest and the long, quiet winters. Everyone knew everyone. Kids rode bikes down Main Street without a care. Doors were left unlocked, and a neighbor's struggle was everyone's struggle. There was a comfort in that, a deep-seated sense of community that outsiders often found quaint, almost anachronistic. But beneath that veneer of idyllic Americana, like the deep roots of the ancient oaks themselves, lay the complex, sometimes tangled, history of a people who had carved out their existence far from the prying eyes of the modern world. They were used to snow, of course. Winters in the Appalachians were always harsh. But what began to brew in the second week of January was different. The weather reports, usually dismissed as big city sensationalism, grew increasingly dire. The wind started to pick up, a low, mournful sigh through the pines long before the first flakes even fell. Old Man Hemlock, a recluse who lived even further up the mountain and claimed to predict the weather by the ache in his knees, had been seen stockpiling firewood for weeks, a grim, knowing look in his eyes. The warnings from the National Weather Service were unprecedented. A polar vortex phenomenon, they called it, predicting a blizzard of historic proportions, an Arctic blast that would sweep down from Canada and collide with moisture-rich air, creating a perfect storm. They spoke of feet of snow, not inches, and temperatures that would plunge far below zero, making even brief exposure a life-threatening risk. Roads would become impassable. Power grids would likely fail. Evacuation advisories were issued for outlying areas, but Oakhaven, with its stubborn pride and deep-rooted belief that they could handle anything nature threw at them, mostly hunkered down. They stocked their pantries, filled their gas tanks, and brought in their livestock, a collective shrug at the impending doom. They'd seen blizzards before. This would just be a bigger one, or so they thought. The first flakes started falling on a Tuesday afternoon, soft and gentle, almost deceptively beautiful. By nightfall, they were coming down in earnest, thick, swirling curtains of white. The wind began to howl, a primal scream that shook the very foundations of the old houses. Telephone lines, already unreliable in Oakhaven, crackled and died. Cell service, a luxury few enjoyed, vanished into static. The town was beginning its slow, deliberate descent into isolation. By Wednesday morning, the world outside was gone. Windows were frosted over, and looking out was like staring into a milky white void, indistinguishable from the sky. Snowdrifts piled against doors, reaching second-story windows. The roar of the wind was constant, a deafening white noise that filled every corner of every home. Then around noon the lights flickered once, twice, and died. The hum of refrigerators, the glow of screens, the warmth of electric heaters all ceased. Oakhaven was plunged into darkness, relying on the flickering flames of fireplaces and the dim glow of battery-powered lanterns. The blizzard raged for 3 full days and 3 full nights. 72 hours of unrelenting fury. 72 hours where Oakhaven ceased to exist on any map, cut off from the world, swallowed whole by the storm. Those 72 hours felt like an eternity. Inside their homes, families huddled together, listening to the relentless assault of the wind and snow, the groaning of old timbers, the occasional sharp crack of a tree branch giving way. They ate canned goods, melted snow for water, and told stories by firelight, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy against the growing dread of the unknown outside. When the storm finally broke on Saturday morning, it wasn't a gradual easing. It was a sudden, almost eerie silence. The wind died down to a whisper, then nothing. The snow stopped falling. The world was utterly, profoundly still. And white. A blinding, pristine, overwhelming white. The mountains, the trees, the houses. Everything was buried under an unimaginable blanket of snow, sculpted into impossible dunes and drifts. For days afterward, no one could get in and no one could get out. The main road into Oakhaven, a narrow, winding state highway, was completely obliterated, buried under 20 feet of snow in some places. Emergency services, already stretched thin across the region, knew Oakhaven was isolated, but assumed the sturdy mountain folk were toughing it out, as they always did. They were wrong. It wasn't until almost a week later, when a specialized plowing crew, equipped with massive rotary snowplows and tracked vehicles, finally managed to punch a path through the frozen labyrinth, that the first glimpse of Oakhaven emerged from the white. The scene that greeted them was surreal. The town was there, perfectly preserved, like a miniature village encased in crystal. Houses stood sentinel, their roofs heavily laden with snow, their chimneys spewing no smoke. Cars were buried up to their windows, forming ghostly white mounds in driveways. The general store, the post office, the church, all stood silent, pristine, and utterly untouched by anything but the snow. There was no sound, no barking dogs, no children's laughter, no hum of generators, just the crunch of the plows and the strained breathing of the rescue workers. As they moved deeper into the town, a chilling realization began to creep in. There were no tracks in the snow, no signs of life, no movement behind any of the frosted windows. Not a single shovel had been lifted to clear a path. Not a single car had been started. Oakhaven was a ghost town. But it wasn't just empty. It felt wrong. It felt frozen in time, like a photograph taken just before the world ended. Except the camera had captured only the setting, not the event. The rescue teams, hardened by years of disaster response, felt a prickle of unease that transcended the natural awe of the snowscape. They began to check the houses, calling out names, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. They broke down doors, expecting to find families huddled together, perhaps suffering from hypothermia or worse. What they found instead was far more unsettling. The homes were often perfectly in order. Half-eaten meals sat on tables, covered in a fine layer of dust. Blankets were neatly folded over couches. Books lay open on nightstands. Clothes hung in closets. It was as if everyone had simply stepped out. But into what? Into a blizzard that would have instantly claimed them? And why were there no bodies? No signs of struggle? No desperate attempts to dig out? Oakhaven was buried, yes. But the people were gone. And that was just the beginning of the mystery. Because as the days turned into weeks, and the investigation intensified, they began to uncover things that suggested the blizzard wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a curtain, a veil pulled over a truth so dark, so inexplicable, it defied every logical explanation. What truly happened in Oakhaven during those 3 days and 3 nights of absolute whiteout? And why, even now, does the silence of that buried town still scream loudest of all? Oakhaven, the name itself, once conjuring images of tranquility, now feels like a whisper from a tomb. For me, Michael, it was more than just a name on a map. It was the place my grandmother, Eleanor, called home, a town I visited every summer. Its dusty main street and the scent of pine needles etched into my earliest memories. Before the blizzard, Oakhaven was a postcard from a simpler time. A haven nestled deep in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the northern wilderness. It was a town proud of its isolation, its hardy residents accustomed to harsh winters and the quiet rhythm of life far from the bustling cities. You see, Oakhaven wasn't just a collection of houses. It was a living, breathing entity, its heart beating in the general store where old Mr. Henderson still hand-ground coffee beans, in the diner where Martha served the best apple pie for 200 miles, and in the small, unassuming library where Emily, the librarian, knew every resident's favorite genre. People like David Miller, the town's gruff but kind mechanic, and Sarah Jenkins, who ran the local bakery, were the threads that wove Oakhaven's fabric. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, bound by the shared understanding of their remote existence. This self-reliance, this tight-knit community, was their greatest strength. But as the blizzard approached, it would become their most terrifying vulnerability. The first whispers of the storm came on a Tuesday, a week before Thanksgiving. Local weather channels, usually dismissed with a chuckle, began forecasting an unusually strong cold front. Heavy snowfall possible, the anchors warned, their voices tinged with a seriousness Oakhaven residents rarely heard. James, the town sheriff, a man who'd seen more blizzards than birthdays, just scoffed over coffee at Martha's diner. "Another year, another scare," he'd grumbled, echoing the general sentiment. Oakhaven had weathered countless storms. Their homes were built sturdy, their pantries stocked, their generators fueled. They were prepared for winter always, but this time it was different. By Wednesday, the forecast shifted from heavy snowfall possible to severe blizzard warning. The governor declared a state of emergency for the northern counties, urging residents to stay indoors. Still, Oakhaven remained largely unfazed. A few extra trips to Henderson's store for milk and bread, some last-minute shoveling, but no real panic. Life continued, oblivious to the encroaching white monster. It was the kind of stubborn defiance born of generations battling the elements, a quiet pride that would soon be shattered. The first flakes began to fall early Thursday morning. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes that herald the start of winter, but fat, heavy pellets, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry wolf. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural speed, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of hours. By noon, the world outside was a swirling vortex of white, visibility reduced to mere feet. The wind shrieked, a relentless, deafening scream that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the houses. Snow piled up in drifts so fast it felt less like falling and more like being actively buried. Power flickered, then died, plunging the entire town into a sudden, unsettling silence, broken only by the raging tempest outside. Cell service, always spotty in Oakhaven, vanished entirely. Landlines, usually reliable, crackled with static before going dead. The town was cut off, an island of humanity adrift in a sea of white, utterly isolated. Panic, a quiet, insidious thing, began to creep in. It wasn't the frantic, screaming kind, but a cold, gnawing dread. People huddled by their fireplaces, listening to the relentless battering of the wind, the creaks and groans of their homes struggling against the onslaught. Children, initially excited by the snow day, grew quiet, sensing the fear in their parents' eyes. The blizzard wasn't just a storm. It was a living entity, pressing against every window, every door, trying to force its way in. But even as the storm raged, something else, something far more unsettling, began to emerge. Days before the whiteout, a subtle shift had occurred in Oakhaven. Old Mrs. Gable, known for her vibrant garden and even more vibrant gossip, had suddenly stopped answering her phone. Her neighbor, young Jessica, a high school student who often helped Mrs. Gable with chores, had mentioned seeing Mrs. Gable's lights on late at night, but no sign of her during the day. Jessica had even tried knocking but received no answer. She dismissed it, thinking Mrs. Gable might be under the weather, but the memory lingered, a tiny, unsettling prickle at the back of her mind. Then there was the strange incident at the town hall. Mayor Thompson, a stickler for routine, had reported a minor break-in just 2 nights before the storm hit. Nothing was stolen, no damage done, but the front door, usually double-locked, had been found ajar, and a single muddy footprint led from the entrance directly to the mayor's personal office. The sheriff had chalked it up to a prank, a bored teenager, but Mayor Thompson had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperatures. Felt deliberate. A message, perhaps? But from whom and why? These were small things, easily overlooked amidst the growing fury of the blizzard. But for those who remembered them later, they would become chilling precursors, tiny cracks in the facade of Oakhaven's peaceful existence. As Thursday bled into Friday, the blizzard intensified beyond anything Oakhaven had ever seen. Snowdrifts swallowed entire cars, reaching up to the second-story windows of homes. The very air was thick with ice particles, making breathing a painful struggle for anyone brave or foolish enough to venture outside. The roar of the wind was a constant, maddening companion, a sound that began to chip away at the edges of sanity. Inside the isolated homes, the initial bravado gave way to a deeper, more primal fear. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. Generators, meant for short outages, churned through fuel. The cold seeped in, an insidious enemy finding every crack, every crevice. People huddled closer, not just for warmth but for comfort. for the reassurance of another human presence against the overwhelming indifferent white. But as the hours turned into days, and the storm showed no signs of relenting, a new kind of tension began to fester. The isolation, initially a shared burden, began to feel like a cage. Rumors, whispered in the dim light of lanterns, began to circulate. Had anyone seen Mr. Davies from down the street? Why hadn't the emergency services responded? Was anyone even trying to reach them? The questions grew, fueled by fear and the relentless pressure of being cut off from the world. Oakhaven wasn't just buried under snow. It was buried under a shroud of silence, a silence that amplified every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every beat of a terrified heart. And in that silence, trapped within their homes, the residents of Oakhaven began to realize that the blizzard was only the beginning. The real terror, the one that would forever scar their memory, was only just starting to awaken. The morning light, when it finally broke through the churning gray, was less a promise of dawn and more a stark revelation of the blizzard's brutal victory. Oakhaven was gone, swallowed whole. Streets had vanished, cars were mere humps beneath impossible drifts, and houses, once distinct, now huddled together under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The world outside had been completely redesigned, a monochrome landscape of silent, sculpted snow, stretching endlessly in every direction. Inside Sarah Miller's small, cozy home, the silence was almost more terrifying than the howling wind had been. The power was out, of course. The furnace had gasped its last hours ago, leaving the air with a biting chill that seeped into bones. Her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, shivered beside her under a pile of blankets on the living room couch, her small face pale. Sarah had tried the landline, then her cell phone. Nothing. Just the dead hum of a disconnected world. The isolation was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She peered out the window, wiping condensation from the glass. The snow was piled so high it reached the top of her first-floor windows. It was like living in a cave of ice. As her eyes scanned the pristine, untouched expanse of her backyard, a small detail snagged her attention. Near the fence line, where the snow was deepest and most undisturbed, was a faint, irregular depression. It wasn't a perfect circle, not a natural drift. It looked like something had been there. A large, heavy indentation, almost like a giant, misshapen footprint, though far too big for any animal she knew in these parts. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. It was still there, a shadow in the uniform white. Her heart gave a sudden, uncomfortable lurch. It was probably just a trick of the light, she told herself, the snow playing games with her tired mind. But the unease lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. Across town, David Chun was battling the snow with a shovel that felt increasingly useless. He was a man of routine, a former Marine, and he hated feeling helpless. His driveway, usually a short path to his garage, was now a monumental undertaking. Every scoop of snow revealed only more snow, an endless, mocking expanse. He tried to clear a path to the main road, just to see the extent of it, but after an hour of backbreaking work, he realized it was futile. The drifts were mountainous, impassable. Oakhaven was truly cut off. As he paused, leaning on his shovel, breath misting in the frigid air, he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, carried on the crisp, still air. It wasn't the wind. The wind had died down to an occasional whisper. It wasn't the creaking of his house settling or the drip of melting snow. It was a low, resonant thrumming, like a distant generator struggling, or perhaps something even more mechanical, but entirely out of place in this silent, snow-buried world. He frowned, turning his head, trying to pinpoint its direction. It seemed to come from the direction of the old abandoned sawmill on the outskirts of town, a place that had been derelict for decades. He dismissed it as an auditory hallucination, a phantom sound born of the deep quiet. His ears were probably ringing from the cold, or maybe it was just the blood rushing in his head. But the sound, though it faded, left an imprint, a question mark in the back of his mind. Later that afternoon, David retreated inside, defeated by the snow and the growing chill. He had his emergency radio, a battery-powered relic, but it was silent. Nothing but static, a testament to the complete communications blackout. He fiddled with the dial, hoping for a crackle, a voice, anything from the outside world. Suddenly, through the hiss of static, a faint, garbled sound broke through. It wasn't a weather report, not a news broadcast. It was distorted, a jumble of low-frequency noise and what sounded like rhythmic clicks, almost like a heartbeat, but too slow, too deep. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the relentless static. David froze, his hand hovering over the dial. He tried to tune it back desperately but found nothing. He shook his head. Maybe the batteries were dying. Maybe the radio was just old. But that sound, it had been unlike anything he'd ever heard on a radio before. It had felt deliberate. Meanwhile, Emily Carter, a woman who had lived in Oakhaven for all of her 78 years, found herself surprisingly calm in the face of the storm's aftermath. She had seen blizzards before, though none quite like this. Her old house, built by her grandfather, was sturdy, and she had a well-stocked pantry. But as the day wore on, even her seasoned resilience began to fray. She was alone, utterly alone. The silence in her house was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the old timbers. She was in her kitchen, trying to coax a flickering flame from a gas burner for tea, when she heard it. A light scratching sound, coming from the attic directly above her. It wasn't the scuttling of mice. She knew that sound well. This was different, more deliberate, almost like fingernails dragging across wood, slowly, rhythmically. She paused, her hand hovering over the kettle. "Hello," she called out, her voice a reedy whisper in the vast quiet. No answer, only the continued, unnerving scratching. Her heart began to pound with a frantic rhythm. She told herself it was just the house settling, the old wood groaning under the weight of the snow and the changing temperature. But the sound seemed to move from one end of the attic to the other, a slow, methodical traversal. Then through her front window, a window that offered a narrow, snow-framed view of her neighbor's house, she saw it. A faint, intermittent glow, deep within the second story of the old Henderson place. The Hendersons had left for Florida weeks ago, their house dark and empty since before Thanksgiving. Emily knew this for a fact. Yet, there it was again, a soft bluish light, appearing and disappearing behind a curtain. It wasn't a flicker of emergency lights from a distant generator. It was too steady, too localized. It was like someone was walking around in a dark room, holding a light source, moving from window to window. She pressed her face closer to the cold glass, her breath fogging it. The light vanished completely. She waited, her eyes straining in the dimming afternoon light. Nothing. Just as she was about to dismiss it as her imagination, a trick of the fading daylight, the light reappeared, brighter this time, and then quickly dimmed. It was definitely inside the Henderson house. Emily felt a chill colder than the air seeping from the windows. The Hendersons were gone. No one should be in that house. And with the power out everywhere, where would that light even be coming from? As dusk began to settle, painting the snow-covered town in shades of bruised purple and gray, a pervasive sense of dread began to creep through Oakhaven. It wasn't just the isolation or the cold or the dwindling supplies. It was something more insidious. People reported strange incidents. A family on Elm Street swore they heard faint, echoing voices from their basement, even though it was completely empty. A young couple on Maple Avenue found their front door slightly ajar, despite having locked it securely and piled snow against it from the inside. Nothing was missing, but the chilling realization that someone or something had been there was enough to turn their blood to ice. The strangest incident, however, occurred at the edge of town, near the old cemetery. Old Mr. Henderson, a reclusive man who rarely ventured out, had a prize-winning German shepherd named Brutus. Brutus was a formidable animal, fiercely loyal and notoriously loud. That evening, Mr. Henderson, bundled in layers, braved the snow to check on his dog, who usually barked incessantly at the slightest movement. But Brutus was silent. Mr. Henderson called his name, his voice echoing in the eerie quiet. No response. He found the kennel door wide open, ripped from its hinges as if by immense force. Inside there was no sign of Brutus, no tracks in the snow leading away, no struggle, just the empty, silent kennel. And on the frozen ground, near where the dog's water bowl usually sat, was a single dark, glistening smear. Too dark for blood, too thick for water. It looked like tar, or some kind of viscous black oil. Mr. Henderson, his hands trembling, stared at it, a primal fear seizing him. Brutus would never have left. Not willingly. The blizzard had buried Oakhaven, cutting it off from the outside world. But now, as the first full night of isolation descended, the residents began to understand that the snow was merely a shroud. Beneath it, in the deep, suffocating quiet, something had stirred. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that was now awake, moving through the silent, snow-buried streets, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a growing, suffocating terror. The real nightmare, the one that gnawed at the edges of their sanity, had only just begun its slow, deliberate crawl. The frigid air bit at their exposed skin, each gust of wind a physical blow, driving snow into every crevice. The town of Havenwood lay before them, a spectral landscape of white, its familiar contours softened, distorted, rendered alien by the relentless blizzard. The silence, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the crunch of their boots on the packed snow, was heavier than any sound, a suffocating blanket of dread. Michael led the way, his face grim, eyes constantly scanning the shrouded houses. Jessica walked close behind, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her backpack, a nervous habit that did little to calm her racing heart. David, ever the pragmatist, kept a steady pace, his gaze analytical, searching for anomalies. Emily, however, struggled. Each shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat. Each moan of the wind sounded like a whisper of doom. Her breath hitched in her throat with every step, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. Their first stop was the house of the Millers, just a few doors down from Michael's own. A small, cozy home, usually adorned with cheerful porch decorations. Now it was a mound of snow, the windows opaque with frost. Michael tried the front door. Locked. He tried the back, forcing his way through a drift that reached his waist. The back door, surprisingly, was unlocked. A collective shiver ran through the group as they stepped inside. The air was cold, but not freezing, suggesting the heating had been on until recently. The house was spotless, quiet. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle lay on the living room coffee table, a colorful depiction of a mountain landscape. In the kitchen, a mug sat on the counter, still containing the dried remains of what looked like coffee. A child's backpack lay by the door, ready for school. It was as if the Millers had simply walked out, in the middle of a normal day, never to return. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no hasty packing. Just an eerie, immaculate emptiness. "This isn't right," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. "If they evacuated, why leave everything like this? Why no note?" David ran a gloved hand over the kitchen counter. No dust. This wasn't weeks ago. Days maybe, right before the worst of the blizzard hit, or perhaps even during its initial stages. Emily pointed a trembling finger towards a framed photo on the mantelpiece. It showed Mr. and Mrs. Miller smiling, their daughter Lily, perched on her father's shoulders. "Where's Lily? Her backpack is right there. Did they just leave her things?" The question hung in the air, a chilling implication. They spent another 10 minutes meticulously searching the house, finding nothing more than mundane objects frozen in time. A half-read book on a nightstand, a pair of glasses beside it, a charging phone, but without a signal, its screen dark. It was the normalcy of it all that was so deeply unsettling. They moved on, checking a handful of other houses on the street. Each one presented a similar tableau. Untouched, undisturbed, yet utterly devoid of life. The fear began to morph into something more profound, a sense of unreality. This wasn't a natural disaster's aftermath. It felt like a stage play, set perfectly, but with the actors having vanished into thin air. Their next destination was the town's small sheriff's office, a brick building near the main square. It was their best hope for answers, for any communication, any record of what might have happened. The snowdrifts here were monumental, almost burying the parked patrol car. Michael had to kick and shovel his way to the front door, which, like the Miller's back door, was unlocked. Inside, the office was dim, lit only by the weak light filtering through the snow-laden windows. The air was stale cold. The radio on the desk was silent, its red light out. The computer screen was blank. Sheriff Thompson's desk was cluttered with paperwork, a half-eaten sandwich in a plastic bag beside a stack of reports. A coffee mug, still with a spoon in it, sat precariously close to the edge. "Sheriff Thompson always finished his coffee," Emily murmured, her voice laced with a fresh wave of anxiety. "He's meticulous." David moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the documents. "Looks like he was working on something. These are incident reports from last week. Nothing unusual. Petty theft, a lost dog." He paused, picking up a small leather-bound notebook. "This looks like his personal log." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. Most entries were routine: patrol routes, community meetings, weather observations. But then his finger stopped. Listen to this. Dated 2 days ago, right as the blizzard was intensifying. He cleared his throat, reading aloud. Strange reports coming in from the outskirts. Old Man Hemlock swearing he saw lights in the sky, moving too fast for any plane. Dismissed it as cabin fever, but then Mrs. Henderson called, frantic about her dogs. Said they were acting wild, barking at nothing, trying to dig through the floorboards. Said it felt like something was watching the house. Told her to stay calm. Check her carbon monoxide detector. David looked up, his face pale. Then an hour later, this entry. Henderson house. No signs of forced entry. Dogs gone. Mrs. Henderson gone. No tracks in the fresh snow leading away from the house. Impossible. A profound silence descended, heavier than the blizzard outside. The impossible. No tracks. How could someone vanish without a trace from their own home, with fresh snow on the ground? What about the dogs? Jessica asked, her voice tight. If she was gone and her dogs were gone. It doesn't make sense, Michael said, running a hand through his hair. People don't just evaporate. And the sheriff's log. It sounds like he was investigating something truly bizarre before he too disappeared. He walked to the wall, where a large map of Havenwood was tacked up. Several houses were circled in red. The Miller's house was one of them, the Henderson house another. He was tracking something, David stated, his voice low. These aren't just random disappearances. The sheriff was trying to connect the dots. Emily let out a small choke sound. He didn't find them, did he? He just became one of them. The implication was terrifying. If the sheriff, a trained law enforcement officer, couldn't figure out what was happening, what hope did they have? And if he too had vanished, it meant whatever was taking people was still here, still active. David continued to examine the logbook. There's a final entry scrawled almost illegibly. It says, "They aren't leaving, they're taking." And it's not the blizzard. It's the silence. The silence. The word echoed in the small office, chilling them to the bone. The lack of sound, the absence of life, the quiet that now permeated Havenwood. It wasn't just a consequence of the blizzard. It was the very nature of the terror. Suddenly, a faint metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper within the building. It was soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind's howl, but it was there. A distinct sound that didn't belong. Every head snapped towards the back hallway, where the holding cells and evidence locker were located. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. They were not alone. The realization was a cold, sharp stab of adrenaline. Was it another survivor? Or something else? Something that might have been waiting in the dark corners of the sheriff's office, just as they had walked in? Michael gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam a weak spear against the encroaching gloom. "Stay together," he whispered, his voice taut with suppressed fear. "David, stay behind me. Jessica, Emily, you're in the middle." He took a tentative step towards the hallway, his boots crunching on the dusty linoleum. The air grew colder, heavy with an unseen presence. The clang hadn't been repeated, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. It was a listening silence, a silence that felt like it was holding its breath. They crept forward, each shadow a potential threat, each creak of the old building sending jolts of terror through them. The hallway was narrow, lined with old filing cabinets. At the end, a heavy steel door, usually leading to the evidence room, was slightly ajar. A sliver of deeper darkness beckoned from within. Michael pushed the door open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was small, filled with shelves overflowing with confiscated items, old case files, and crime scene kits. But in the center of the room, on the concrete floor, was a single solitary object. It was a small, ornate music box made of dark wood, intricately carved with images of swirling snow and bare trees. It wasn't open, but as Michael's flashlight beam illuminated it, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the box. And then from deep within its mechanism, a soft, ethereal melody began to play. A lullaby, hauntingly beautiful, yet utterly out of place in the desolate quiet of the sheriff's office. No one had touched it. No one had wound it. It simply began to play, its delicate notes filling the room, weaving a tapestry of impossible sound. And as the melody drifted through the air, they all felt it. A profound, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. It was the cold of something ancient, something malevolent, that had been patiently waiting for them, and had now announced its presence. The sheriff's final cryptic message about the silence took on a terrifying new meaning. The silence wasn't just an absence, it was a prelude, and the music box, playing its impossible lullaby, was the first note in a symphony of terror they were only just beginning to comprehend. The blizzard had not only buried the town, it had cradled a secret, a dark, pulsing heart of dread that had now awoken. And they, the last few remaining souls, were trapped within its chilling melody. The air in the small, cramped sheriff's office was thick with unarticulated terror. Michael, his face a mask of disbelief and grim resignation, stared at the flickering gas lamp. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he ran them through his graying hair. This isn't right," he finally managed, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "People don't just vanish. And the snow, it's like it's alive." Sarah, her mind racing, felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones, but it was accompanied by a strange, almost morbid curiosity. This was beyond any story she'd ever chased. "It's more than just people vanishing, Michael. It's the way they're gone. No struggle, no tracks. Just absence. And what about those whispers, that feeling we've all had?" Emily, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to stem from a deeper, older knowledge, nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to talk about it. Old Oakhaven stories. Things that sleep under the ice, waiting for the harsh winters. They used to say the town was built on a place that shouldn't have been disturbed." David, ever the pragmatist, scoffed, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Superstitious nonsense, Emily. We're talking about a blizzard, maybe some deranged individual or a pack of wolves. Keep your head on straight." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously towards the reinforced door, as if expecting something to claw its way through the thick wood. "Wolves don't hum," Sarah countered, her voice tight. "Wolves don't make the air feel like it's vibrating with sorrow and malice." She remembered the distinct, low-thrumming sound she'd heard just before Jessica's disappearance, a sound she'd initially dismissed as wind, but now understood was something far more sinister. Michael slammed a fist softly on the desk, the sound muffled by the snow pressing against the windows. "Superstition or not, we have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait to be picked off one by one." He looked at Sarah, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "You're smart, Sarah. You see things. What do you think is happening?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. "It feels like something woke up. The blizzard isn't just a storm. It's a curtain, a shield, and underneath it, something old, something hungry is moving." She paused, a new thought crystallizing. "Emily, what did your grandmother say specifically about things under the ice?" Emily shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "She called it the grave's whisper, said it fed on silence and despair, that it came when the world outside forgot Oakhaven, when the cold was so deep it could freeze a soul." Her voice dropped to a barely audible murmur. "She said it wasn't evil in the way humans understand it, just ancient and hungry." David rolled his eyes, but a tremor in his voice betrayed his unease. "Still sounds like a campfire story to me. How do we fight a grave's whisper?" "We don't know if we can fight it," Sarah admitted, "but we can understand it. If it's an old legend, there must be a way to either appease it or banish it, or at least understand its patterns." She looked around the small office. "Is there anywhere in town that would hold old records? Local history? A library, perhaps? An old church?" Michael rubbed his temples. "The old Oakhaven Historical Society building. It's on Elm Street, near the edge of town. Used to be the town hall, full of dusty old books and archives. But it's probably buried under 20 feet of snow." "We have to try," Sarah insisted, her determination hardening. "If we stay here, we're just waiting for it to find us. At least out there we might find answers." The idea of venturing back into the blizzard, knowing what lurked within its swirling depths, was terrifying. Yet, the thought of remaining stagnant, waiting for the unknown to claim them, was even worse. Michael, after a moment of grim contemplation, nodded. "All right, but we go prepared. Rope, lanterns, whatever we can find for self-defense. And we stick together. No heroics, no wandering off." His eyes scanned the group, settling on David. "You with us, David?" David hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the door, then back to the desperate faces of Sarah, Michael, and Emily. The terror was palpable, but so was the nascent spark of defiance. "What choice do we have?" he muttered, grabbing a rusty crowbar that lay forgotten in a corner. Armed with flashlights, a couple of old lanterns, and a coil of thick rope, they prepared to brave the renewed fury of the blizzard. Michael managed to pry open a supply cabinet, revealing an old hunting rifle and a handful of shells, which he handed to David, keeping a heavy-duty flashlight for himself. Sarah carried a small backpack with essentials, and Emily clutched a heavy, antique compass she'd found in her grandmother's belongings. Stepping out of the relative warmth of the sheriff's office was like walking into another dimension. The wind howled, a banshee's wail that seemed to carry the very essence of the grave's whisper. Snow fine as dust whipped around them, stinging their exposed skin. Visibility was almost zero. They had to hold on to each other, moving in a tight, desperate cluster, each step a battle against the overwhelming force of the storm. The journey to Elm Street felt endless. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name. Sarah kept her flashlight beam sweeping, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw things in the swirling white fleeting shapes, darker than the snow, glimpsed only at the very edge of her vision. Were they real? Or was the strain of terror playing tricks on her mind? Suddenly, Emily gasped, pointing a trembling finger into the white void. "Look!" Through a momentary lull in the wind, a shape materialized. It wasn't an animal, nor a human. It was a shifting, indistinct mass, darker than the deepest shadow, coalescing and dissipating within the snow itself. It seemed to pulse, a faint rhythmic thrumming sound now distinctly audible above the wind's shriek. It was the chilling melody made manifest. Michael raised his flashlight, its beam piercing the gloom, but the light seemed to be absorbed by the entity, not illuminating it. The thrumming grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. It was a sound that didn't just reach their ears, but resonated through their bones, a primordial hum of ancient hunger. David, clutching the rifle, aimed it instinctively, but his hand shook so violently he couldn't possibly steady it. What was he supposed to shoot? A shadow? A feeling? The entity, if it could be called that, didn't seem to move directly towards them. Instead, it seemed to flow around a nearby snow-covered house, leaving an impression of profound cold and an almost suffocating sense of despair in its wake. It was as if the very air curdled where it passed. "Don't look at it directly," Emily cried out, her voice raw with fear. "It feeds on attention. On fear." Sarah tore her gaze away, forcing herself to breathe, to focus. Emily's grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Feeds on silence and despair." Asterisk, not evil in the way humans understand it. Just ancient. And hungry. Asterisk, this wasn't a monster to be slain with bullets. This was something else entirely. They pressed on, the encounter leaving them shaken to their core. The historical society building finally loomed before them, a dark, snow-choked silhouette against the white. The front door was buried, but Michael, with David's help, managed to clear enough snow to reveal a side entrance. The lock was old, rusted, and easily forced open by Michael's crowbar. Inside, the air was frigid, thick with the scent of dust, mildew, and forgotten paper. Their flashlights cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing rows upon rows of shelves laden with ancient tomes, yellowed documents, and curiosities from Oakhaven's past. It was a mausoleum of history, a place where secrets were interred. "All right," Michael said, his voice echoing in the silence. "Split up. Look for anything, journals, town records, anything that mentions Graves' whisper or strange occurrences. We don't have much time." They fanned out, their anxieties momentarily overshadowed by the urgency of their task. Sarah found herself in a section labeled Local Legends and Folklore, her flashlight beam dancing across titles that seemed to hum with forgotten whispers. She pulled out a brittle, leather-bound journal, its cover etched with faded symbols she didn't recognize. The handwriting inside was spidery and archaic, but legible. As she began to read, a chill far colder than the building's air crept up her spine. The journal belonged to Elias Thorne, one of Oakhaven's founding fathers, written in the late 1700s. His entries began innocently enough, detailing the struggles of establishing a settlement in the harsh wilderness. But as the pages turned, a darker narrative emerged. The winter of '98, an entry read asterisk, has brought with it a terror no man could have foreseen. The cold bites deeper than any before, and with it, a presence has awoken. We hear it in the wind, a mournful hum. Our livestock vanish. Then our kin. They say it is the land itself, displeased by our intrusion. But I say it is something far older, far more malevolent. It drains the warmth, the light, the very essence of life from this valley. Asterisk. Sarah's breath hitched. This was it. The origin. But what was it? And how could it be stopped? She flipped forward, desperate for answers. We tried to appease it. Another entry stated, asterisk, leaving offerings, chanting old rites learned from the native tribes who once called this land home. It seemed to quiet for a time. But these rituals, they only fed it. It grows stronger with each sacrifice, each act of fear. It hungers not just for life, but for the very act of dread. It is a parasitic entity, a living void that consumes not just bodies but hope. Asterisk. Parasitic entity, a living void. It consumed dread. The pieces were starting to click into place with horrifying clarity. The whispers, the feeling of despair, the fear they'd all felt. It wasn't just a byproduct, it was its food. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the silence of the library. It was David. The sound was abruptly cut short, replaced by a sickening wet thud, followed by a guttural, inhuman gurgle that seemed to vibrate from the very foundations of the building. Sarah froze, the journal clutched in her trembling hands. The chilling melody, now a triumphant, hungry thrum, filled the air. It was no longer outside. It was inside with them, and it had just claimed its next victim. The blizzard had not only buried the town, it had brought the ancient horror right into their sanctuary, sealing their fate within its icy grasp. The chilling void left by Mrs. Gable's sudden, impossible disappearance was a gaping wound in the heart of their fragile sanctuary. One moment she was there, her hand trembling as she clutched a worn copy of a local history book, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored their own. The next, the spot where she stood was empty, a faint, lingering scent of ozone and something akin to frozen pine needles hanging heavy in the air. The book lay abandoned on the dusty floor, its pages splayed open to an old, faded map of Blackwood Creek. A collective gasp, a strangled cry, then a suffocating silence descended. Emily was the first to break it, a raw, guttural scream tearing from her throat as she stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old newspapers. David rushed to her, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, pulling her up and scanning the room wildly, as if the air itself might reveal the missing woman. Mrs. Gable? Michael's voice was a hoarse whisper, his eyes darting from the empty space to the faces of the remaining survivors. Panic, cold and sharp, began to spread like an infection. They were no longer just trapped by the blizzard. They were hunted from within. The library, once a symbol of refuge, had become a sealed tomb. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, forced herself to move, her breath ragged. She reached the spot where Mrs. Gable had vanished, knelt, and ran her gloved hand over the floorboards. Nothing. No blood, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. Just the lingering alien chill. She just evaporated, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden, frantic pounding of her own heart. Like smoke in the wind. The other survivors huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a terror that bypassed logic. A young man named Kevin, who had been quietly trying to fix a broken radio, dropped it with a clang, scattering its components across the floor. He backed away, bumping into a bookshelf, his gaze fixed on the empty space. What was that? What is that thing? He stammered, his voice cracking. Michael, despite the terror knotting in his stomach, knew he had to regain control. Chaos would be their true undoing. Everyone, stay together. No one moves alone, he commanded, his voice strained but firm. He swept his gaze across the faces, trying to project an authority he didn't feel. Did anyone see anything? A shadow? A shape? Silence. Only the howling wind outside, a mournful dirge, and the creaks of the old building protesting against the blizzard's relentless assault answered him. David, ever the logical one, was already on his feet, his mind racing. It wasn't a physical attack. No sound, no struggle. It was an absorption, a displacement. He picked up the forgotten book Mrs. Gable had been holding. The old map was of Blackwood Creek, but beneath it, on the opposing page, was a faded, hand-drawn illustration. It depicted a swirling vortex of ice and shadow, reaching out with tendrils of frost towards a huddled figure. Below it, in archaic script, were a few lines. When the sky veil tears and the white breath entombs, the cold maw hungers for the light it consumes. His voice fell silent as he read the words aloud, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. The others leaned in, their faces grim, their desperation growing with each chilling word. "The cold maw," Emily repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "What does that even mean?" Michael snatched the book from David. He stared at the drawing, then at the eerie inscription. "This isn't just a blizzard, is it? This is something else. Something ancient." His mind flashed back to the strange, almost intelligent patterns in the snow, the feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence. Jessica, her eyes fixed on the illustration, felt a prickle of recognition, a half-forgotten memory stirring. Mrs. Gable. She was always talking about local folklore, old stories about the winter wraith, or the sky eater, that would come when the blizzards were too hungry. She shuddered. "We thought she was just an old woman telling tall tales." "Tall tales don't make people disappear into thin air," David retorted, his voice edged with a new kind of fear. The fear of the unknown, of the truly inexplicable. "This book, it's a local history, right? Maybe there's more in here. Or in the archives." The library, once their safe haven, now felt like a labyrinth of potential answers and hidden dangers. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a footstep. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill seeping into their bones that had nothing to do with the blizzard raging outside. It was the cold of a predator, the icy breath of something that didn't belong in their world. They began to search, a frantic, desperate scavenger hunt for truth. Michael, David, and Jessica took charge, organizing the remaining survivors into small groups. One group was tasked with reinforcing the doors and windows, stuffing blankets and books into every crevice, not to keep the cold out, but to keep it from getting further in or perhaps from getting them out. Another group, armed with flashlights and a grim determination, began to scour the library's older sections, pulling down dusty tomes, searching for anything that might shed light on the cold maw or the sky veil. Emily, still shaken but determined to contribute, joined the search group. She found herself drawn to a section on local legends and indigenous myths. Her fingers traced the spines of forgotten books, each one a testament to the town's long isolated history. The silence in the library was punctuated only by their hushed whispers, the rustle of turning pages, and the relentless shriek of the blizzard. As they searched, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered erratically, even though the generator was running steadily. Books would occasionally slide off shelves with a soft thud, even when no one was near. The temperature in certain corners of the library would drop suddenly, causing their breath to plume in the frigid air, only to return to normal moments later. It was as if the entity was playing with them, a cat toying with trapped mice. Each incident was a subtle reminder of its presence, a psychological torment designed to fray their already shattered nerves. Suddenly, a sharp metallic ping echoed from the far end of the children's section, followed by a muffled whimper. Everyone froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Michael, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, led the way, Jessica and David close behind. They found Kevin, pale and trembling, huddled behind a display of picture books. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, part of a mobile that hung above a reading nook, lay on the floor, its string cleanly severed. Kevin pointed a shaky finger upwards. It just dropped, and the mobile, it was spinning, fast, like someone just spun it with incredible force. There was no draft, no explanation, just the severed string and the chilling implication. The entity wasn't just lurking, it was interacting, subtly at first, then more overtly, making its presence felt in ways that defied explanation. They continued their desperate search. David, poring over an old Blackwood Creek almanac from the early 1900s, let out a sudden sharp intake of breath. "Listen to this," he said, his voice tight with discovery. He read aloud, his flashlight beam illuminating the brittle page. "The winter of 27. The long silence. A blizzard unlike any seen before or since. Buried the town for weeks. Nearly a third of the population vanished without a trace. No bodies found. No tracks in the snow. Just gone." The survivors spoke of a whispering cold that stole souls and silenced screams. The town was almost abandoned after that, until new settlers, unaware of the history, slowly rebuilt. A collective shiver ran through the group. The parallels were chillingly clear. "The long silence," Michael murmured, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the terrified survivors. "It happened before. And it's happening again." Jessica, meanwhile, had found something equally disturbing. In a forgotten corner behind a stack of dusty microfiches, she unearthed a crudely bound, leather-covered journal. Its pages were filled with frantic, looping handwriting, interspersed with rough sketches. "It's a personal account," she announced, her voice barely above a whisper, "from a local named Elias Thorne, dated 1927. She opened it to a page marked with a dried, dark stain. "He writes about the blizzard, about the disappearances. He calls it the breath of the void. He believed it wasn't a creature but a force, an ancient primal hunger that manifested in extreme cold, drawn to life, to warmth, to sound." She read, her voice trembling. "It seeks to consume all light, all sound, all warmth. It is the ultimate silence, the ultimate cold. And when it has taken enough, it retreats, leaving only the memory of its chill behind. It feeds on fear, on desperation. It grows stronger with each soul it claims." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Not a monster they could fight, but a force. A sentient, malevolent hunger. It was worse than any creature they could have imagined. It explained the lack of physical signs, the sudden disappearances. It explained the growing, unnatural cold. Michael's eyes met Jessica's, a grim understanding passing between them. "So, it doesn't just kill us," he said, his voice hollow. "It consumes us. And the more afraid we are, the stronger it gets." The realization was a punch to the gut. Their fear, their panic, their very survival instincts were fueling the entity that hunted them. They were trapped in a library, surrounded by the echoes of a past horror, confronted by an enemy that fed on their very essence. The blizzard outside raged on, a white curtain drawn across the world, sealing them in with the ultimate silence. The next page in Elias Thorne's journal, Jessica noticed, simply had one word scrawled over and over again, until the ink ran dry. Silence. 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 Asterisk. The air in the library seemed to grow even heavier, the cold biting deeper. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the space, a sound that seemed to resonate not in their ears, but in their very bones. It was the sound of something vast, something ancient stirring, and it was hungry. The hum intensified, not just a sound anymore, but a pressure against their eardrums, their chests vibrating through the very soles of their boots. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with an unseen force that seemed to push in on them from all sides. Dust, fine as flour, began to sift down from the mine's ceiling, catching the weak beams of their headlamps like shimmering motes in a restless subterranean ocean. Then came the tremor. It wasn't the gentle rolling shake of an earthquake, but a deep resonant rumble that started beneath their feet and climbed rapidly, a violent convulsion that made the ancient timbers groan and crack with an agonizing protest. Loose rocks, some as small as pebbles, others the size of fists, began to cascade down the narrow shaft, forcing them to duck and shield their heads. David instinctively pulled Sarah closer, his arm a desperate anchor against the escalating chaos. Michael, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, was silent, his face pale and drawn in the flickering light, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored their own. The hum peaked, a deafening, almost physical roar that seemed to tear at the fabric of the mine itself. A section of the rock wall to their left, previously unremarkable and solid, suddenly lurched inward with a sickening groan, timber splintering like dry twigs. A gaping maw, jagged and dark, tore open in the rock, revealing not more solid earth, but an abyss of deeper, more profound blackness. A blast of impossibly cold air, carrying with it a scent like ancient ice and something else, something metallic and utterly alien, rushed out, extinguishing one of their headlamps and sending a fresh wave of terror through them. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the lingering vibrations. David shone his remaining lamp into the newly revealed opening. It was not a natural fissure. The edges looked almost carved, though by what he couldn't fathom. Beyond the initial jumble of broken rock, a passage stretched into the unknown, sloping downwards at a sharper angle than any other part of the Oakhaven mine. There were no wooden supports here, no signs of human excavation. This was something else entirely. "This isn't on any map," Michael breathed, his voice hoarse. This is older. Much older." The hum had receded to a low thrum, a steady, pulsing beat that felt less like a sound and more like the rhythm of a colossal hidden heart. It was coming from within that newly opened passage, against every instinct screaming for them to turn and run. An irresistible pull, a morbid curiosity drew them forward. They were explorers, after all, driven by the need to uncover the truth, even if that truth promised only despair. David led the way, his lamp beam cutting a nervous path through the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder with every step, so cold that their breath plumed visibly, tiny clouds in the frigid air. The walls of this new passage were smooth in places, rough in others, not carved with tools but seemingly worn by eons of passage, or perhaps by something else entirely. Strange phosphorescent mosses clung to patches of the rock, casting an eerie, faint green glow that pulsed in time with the distant hum. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above them, lost in shadow, but the floor stretched out, a vast expanse of dark, polished rock. In the center of this immense space stood an enormous, monolithic structure. It was a crude altar, fashioned from colossal, jagged blocks of obsidian-like stone, radiating an aura of ancient malevolence. On the altar's flat surface, partially obscured by a thin layer of crystalline dust, lay something truly disturbing. It was a collection of fossilized remains, not of any creature known to science. Skeletal fragments, twisted and elongated, with too many joints and too few familiar features, were arranged in a macabre tableau. There were no human bones, but the sheer scale and alien nature of these remains sent a shiver down their spines that had nothing to do with the cold. Amidst the bones, a strange, viscous, amber-colored resin had solidified, forming grotesque, organic sculptures that seemed to writhe even in stillness. Sarah, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination, pointed a trembling finger. "Look on the walls." Etched into the dark stone of the chamber, stretching across hundreds of feet, were intricate carvings. They were not hieroglyphs or pictograms, but a complex series of symbols, spirals, and angular lines that seemed to throb with a hidden meaning. And interspersed among these symbols were disturbing depictions. Stick figures, clearly human, kneeling before a shadowy, multi-limbed entity. The entity was always depicted with a single, massive eye, and emanating from it were lines that seemed to drain the life force from the kneeling figures. Then Michael spotted something else, tucked away in a small recess near the altar, almost as if deliberately hidden. It was a small leather-bound journal, incredibly old and brittle, its pages yellowed and stained. He carefully reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth leather. This looks like something from the original prospectors," he whispered, his voice hushed with reverence and dread. "But it's not English. It's something older." David took the journal, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it. The script inside was indeed unfamiliar, a strange, flowing cursive that seemed to predate modern languages. But beneath the ancient script, scrawled in a more recognizable, albeit faded, hand, were marginalia, translations, and frantic notes in English. It was clear that someone, perhaps one of Oakhaven's early settlers, had found this journal and attempted to decipher its terrifying contents. He began to read aloud, his voice low and strained. Asterisk, the first ones, they spoke of the sleeper. Not a god, not a demon, but a force. An entity that predates the mountains, predates the very stars. It sleeps beneath Oakhaven, not in rock, but in a prison of its own making, a void between worlds. Asterisk. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A void between worlds? Like another dimension? David ignored her, his eyes glued to the crumbling page. Asterisk, they called it the Great Hunger. It feeds, not on flesh, not on blood, but on essence, on fear, on despair, on the very spark of life itself. Asterisk. A chilling realization dawned on them. The disappearances, the crushing despair that had settled over Oakhaven long before the blizzard. It wasn't just a troubled town, it was a feeding ground. Asterisk, the first ones built the town not for gold, but to contain it, to keep it sleeping, to offer diversions. Small sacrifices perhaps, to keep the hunger sated, to keep the blizzard at bay. Asterisk, David's voice faltered. Asterisk, the blizzard, it is not natural. It is its breath, its veil, a protective shroud it weaves when it begins to stir. Asterisk. Michael stared at the ancient altar, then at the carvings of the multi-limbed entity, then back at David. So, Oakhaven wasn't just built over a mine, it was built over this thing, to keep it dormant. Asterisk, but the balance is broken. Asterisk, David continued, his voice growing more urgent as he found another passage. Asterisk, the gold, the mining. It disturbed the ancient seals. stirred the sleeper from its slumber. The first one's warnings were ignored. The hunger awakens. And with it, the endless winter. Asterisk. He flipped pages frantically, his lamp beam dancing across the frantic scrawls. Asterisk. The entity grows stronger with every life it consumes, with every moment of terror it inflicts. If it fully awakens, if it breaches its prison, the entire world will become its feeding ground. A frozen, lifeless husk. Asterisk. A profound silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the distant, pulsing hum and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The implications were staggering, terrifying. They hadn't just stumbled upon a local mystery, they had unearthed an existential threat. The blizzard wasn't just trapping them. It was a symptom of something far grander, far more sinister. As David finished reading, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the shadows at the far end of the cavern, deeper within the darkness where the light couldn't penetrate. A sound like stone grinding against stone echoed faintly, then a distinct click, followed by a series of soft, scuttling movements that seemed to spiderweb across the vast floor. Sarah let out a small, terrified whimper. "Did you hear that?" Michael's eyes darted frantically into the gloom. "Something's moving, deeper in." The hum pulsed, growing subtly stronger, resonating with a new, hungry urgency. A wave of intense cold washed over them, a bone-chilling cold that felt less like temperature and more like a drain on their very vitality. They were no longer just observers of an ancient horror. They were caught in its awakening, trapped in its lair. David slammed the journal shut. "We have to go. Now. We can't let this thing get out." But as he turned, his lamp beam caught something else, something they had missed in their initial horror. On the floor, leading from the base of the altar and disappearing into the deep shadows where the scuttling sound had originated, were fresh tracks. They were not human, not animal. They were wide, flat indentations with grotesque, multi-toed prints, like something vast and heavy had dragged itself across the polished stone. And they were heading towards them. The air grew heavy with a new, suffocating dread. The hum vibrated through their teeth, through their very skulls. They were no longer alone in the chamber. The ancient, hungry thing was stirring, and it knew they were there. The prison was breached, the seals broken, and the blizzard above was not just a natural disaster, but the entity's chilling embrace, slowly tightening around Oakhaven, preparing for its grand feast. Their escape route back through the collapsed passage was now a death trap. They had to find another way out, and fast, before the sleeper fully awoke, and the endless winter consumed them all. The ground trembled beneath them, a sickening groan echoing from the depths of Oakhaven as the newly opened passage sealed itself with a final, crushing roar. Dust and ice shards rained down, stinging their eyes, filling their lungs with the bitter taste of defeat. The air instantly grew heavier, colder, laden with a palpable sense of ancient malice. Michael, David, Jessica, and Emily stood frozen, staring at the fresh wall of rubble and ice where their escape route had been just moments before. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to consume them. This wasn't just a collapse. It felt deliberate, a final, definitive slam of a door by an unseen hand. "It's gone," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising wind, a tremor running through her. "There's no way back." David slammed his fist against a nearby chunk of frozen earth, frustration warring with despair on his face. "Of course it's gone. This whole town is a trap. Always has been. And we just fell deeper into its maw." Michael, despite the chilling dread that gripped his own heart, knew he had to keep them moving. Despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. "No, David. It's not gone. The way back is gone. But that means we have to find a way forward. There has to be another exit. Oakhaven wasn't always this isolated. There must be old tunnels, mining shafts, something the original settlers used, or even a natural cave system that leads out." He scanned the immediate surroundings, though the encroaching blizzard was quickly erasing any discernible landmarks. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking. The archives. Or the old town hall. If there are any records, any maps, they'd be there. The founders were secretive, but they still kept some documentation, especially if it concerned the town's physical layout or resources. "The town hall," David scoffed, pulling his scarf tighter around his face. "It's probably buried under 20 feet of snow by now. And even if we get there, what makes you think the sleeper wouldn't have destroyed anything useful? It's been active for decades, slowly erasing Oakhaven's history. It's a risk we have to take." Michael countered, his gaze firm. "Staying here is a death sentence. We move. Now, before the sleeper finishes its awakening and this endless winter becomes truly endless." The decision was made, driven by sheer survival instinct. They huddled together, shielding themselves from the relentless wind, and began their treacherous journey across what was once Oakhaven's main street. The blizzard was no longer just a storm. It was an entity, a living, breathing manifestation of the sleeper's power. The snow didn't fall. It swirled with malicious intent, whipping around them in dizzying vortexes, forming fleeting, ghostly shapes in their peripheral vision. The cold was beyond anything they had ever experienced, an insidious chill that seemed to seep into their very bones, threatening to freeze their thoughts, their will. Whispers rode the wind, not distinct words, but a cacophony of lost voices, a mournful chorus that seemed to call out their names, to tempt them to lie down in the snow and succumb. Emily, more sensitive than the others, clutched Michael's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that? It's trying to get into our heads. It wants us to give up." Michael gripped her hand, offering what little comfort he could. "Don't listen to it. Focus on the next step, Emily. Just the next step." Every meter gained was a battle. The once familiar buildings of Oakhaven now loomed like skeletal giants, shrouded in thick ice, their windows staring out like vacant eyes. They passed the old diner, the general store, places that had once held warmth and life, now entombed in a frozen silence broken only by the shriek of the wind and the relentless groan of the town itself. The ground beneath them felt unstable, as if the very earth was shifting and cracking under the pressure of the sleeper's awakening. They could feel a low vibration, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from deep below, a monstrous heartbeat growing stronger with every passing minute. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dark, monolithic shape of the old town hall emerged from the swirling whiteout. It was a formidable structure, built of heavy stone, but even it was not immune to the sleeper's grip. Icicles the size of spears hung from its eaves, and a thick layer of rime covered every surface, making it look like a building carved from solid ice. The main entrance was completely buried, a solid drift reaching up to the second story. "We'll have to find another way in," Jessica stated, her breath pluming in the frigid air. They circled the building, the blizzard clawing at their faces, until David pointed to a small, almost forgotten cellar door on the building's side, partially cleared by a slight dip in the snowdrift. It was old, made of heavy reinforced wood, and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. "That's probably where they stored the coal for the furnace," David grunted, kicking at the snow around it. "Might be our only shot." Working together, their gloved hands growing numb despite the effort, they chipped away at the ice and snow that sealed the door. The effort was agonizing, each blow of their makeshift tools sending jolts of pain through their arms. The air grew perceptibly colder around the door, and a faint, sweet smell, like ozone mixed with something ancient and metallic, began to permeate the air. It was the sleeper's breath, they knew, trying to dissuade them, to freeze them where they stood. With a final desperate heave, Michael and David managed to wrench the heavy wooden door inward. It groaned on ancient hinges, revealing a dark, musty passage leading down into the earth. A wave of icy air, colder than the blizzard outside, rushed out, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and forgotten secrets. "After you," Jessica muttered, pushing Emily gently forward. They descended into the darkness, sealing the cellar door behind them as best they could, cutting themselves off from the howling tempest outside. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant, muffled groan of the sleeper. They fumbled for their flashlights, their beams cutting through the gloom, illuminating a cramped, stone-walled corridor. This wasn't the main archive, but a storage area, filled with dusty crates and forgotten relics of Oakhaven's past. "We need to find the main records room," Jessica said, her voice echoing unervingly. They navigated the labyrinthine passages, each turn bringing them deeper into the building's forgotten lower levels. The cold here was different, a stagnant, oppressive chill that seemed to cling to the walls, radiating from the very stone. After what felt like an hour of searching, they finally stumbled upon a heavy oak door, emblazoned with a tarnished brass plaque that read, "Oakhaven Town Records Restricted Access." This was it. Michael pushed the door open, revealing a large circular room, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves overflowing with ancient ledgers, maps, and cryptic leather-bound journals. The air here was even colder, and a faint shimmering frost coated the edges of the shelves. "Spread out," Michael instructed. "Look for anything. Maps, old blueprints, anything that suggests an alternative route out of Oakhaven, or even details about its geological structure." They began their frantic search, the urgency of their situation pressing down on them. Jessica, with her methodical approach, gravitated towards the oldest-looking documents, pulling down thick, brittle tomes. David, using his practical knowledge of the area, focused on anything that looked like a map or survey. Emily, with her sharp eyes, scanned for anything unusual, any symbol or drawing that seemed out of place. Michael, meanwhile, kept a wary eye on the room, feeling the unsettling presence of the sleeper even in this supposedly secure location. The rhythmic thrumming from deep beneath them was now a more distinct vibration, strong enough to make the dust on the shelves tremble. "Michael, look at this." Jessica's voice was sharp with discovery. She held open a large deer-hide-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. It wasn't written in English as they knew it, but in an archaic script, interspersed with strange symbols. "It's a diary or something similar, from one of the original settlers. And there are drawings. These look like diagrams of tunnels." As she spoke, she pointed to a crudely drawn map on one of the pages. It depicted Oakhaven, but beneath the familiar streets and buildings, a complex network of lines snaked through the earth, converging on a single prominent symbol at the town's edge, a stylized snowflake, but with sharp, almost predatory points. "What is that symbol?" Emily asked, leaning closer. It's a marker," David breathed, his eyes wide. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the Winter's Gate, a hidden passage, a back door out of Oakhaven that only the earliest settlers knew about. He said it was a myth, a children's tale to scare them away from the old mines." He traced a finger along one of the lines on the map. "This path. It leads directly to the old abandoned mine shaft on the northern ridge. But it's not the main shaft. It's a smaller, deeper one, supposedly sealed off after the first winter." Jessica continued to decipher the journal, piecing together fragments of the archaic text. "This entry here. It speaks of the sleeper not as a monster, but as an ancient guardian, a force of primordial winter. It says that for generations the town offered it tribute, a form of ritualistic isolation, a promise to never disturb its slumber. But something changed. The journal hints that the true purpose of Oakhaven was not just to settle, but to contain the sleeper, to keep it from waking. And if it ever fully awakened, the Winter's Gate was the only means of escape, leading to an outer sanctuary beyond its reach." "So the town itself was a prison," Michael murmured, the pieces clicking into place. "And we just helped break the lock. And the sleeper is fully awake now," Emily added, a shiver running through her. "The journal says that when it wakes, it seeks to reclaim what it lost, to spread the endless winter across the world. Oakhaven is just its first victim, its launching pad." The rhythmic thrumming beneath them intensified, accompanied by a low guttural groan that seemed to reverberate through the very stone of the town hall. Dust rained from the ceiling, and a deep, cracking sound echoed from somewhere above. The sleeper was not just awake. It was moving, stretching its ancient, frozen limbs, ready to burst free. "We have to go. Now," Michael urged, grabbing the journal and the map. "David, you know the old mines. Can you lead us to this Winter's Gate?" David nodded, his face grim but resolute. "I think so. It's a long shot and it'll be dangerous. The passages are unstable, and if the sleeper is truly moving, it's our only shot," Jessica finished for him. They scrambled out of the archives, the groaning of the sleeper growing louder, closer. As they made their way back through the cellar passages, the air grew violently cold, and the walls began to weep ice. They could hear the distinct sound of stone grinding against stone, an audible shifting of the very foundations of Oakhaven. The town was tearing itself apart, shedding its skin as the sleeper prepared to rise. They burst out of the cellar door, back into the raging blizzard, but now it was even more furious, more alive. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell in blinding sheets, thick with swirling ice crystals. The town hall itself was groaning, cracks appearing in its ancient stone. David pointed towards the northern ridge, a barely discernible shadow in the maelstrom. "That way. We have to cross the square, then cut through the old residential district." Their journey to the northern ridge was a desperate sprint against an invisible, all-consuming enemy. The sleeper's influence was now absolute. The air crackled with static electricity, and the ground pulsed with its monstrous heartbeat. Icy tendrils like spectral arms seemed to lash out from the swirling snow, brushing against their faces, whispering promises of eternal rest. They saw fleeting, distorted reflections of themselves in the swirling white, their forms twisted and elongated, as if the sleeper was trying to show them their frozen future. They slipped and stumbled, using each other for support, their bodies screaming in protest against the brutal cold and the relentless effort. The old residential district was a ghost town of frozen houses, their roofs collapsing under the weight of the snow and ice, their skeletal frames groaning in the wind. The familiar landmarks were gone, buried under an alien landscape of white. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the base of the northern ridge. The ground here was uneven, littered with frozen boulders and the remnants of collapsed mine structures. David, guided by the ancient map and his grandfather's stories, led them to a particularly dense cluster of ice-encrusted rocks. "It should be here," he gasped, his breath ragged. "Somewhere beneath this pile." They began to clear the snow and ice, their desperation fueling their strength. The ground vibrated violently now, a continuous tremor that threatened to knock them off their feet. Suddenly, Emily cried out, pointing to a dark crevice between two immense, ice-covered boulders. "There! I see something!" Working together, they managed to pry a massive ice-coated stone slab aside, revealing a narrow vertical shaft leading down into absolute darkness. The air rushing up from it was even colder than the blizzard, carrying with it a faint, earthy smell mixed with something ancient and metallic, the same scent they'd noticed at the town hall. This was it, the Winter's Gate. Just as Michael prepared to descend, a deafening roar erupted from the heart of Oakhaven. The ground beneath them convulsed violently, and the entire northern ridge groaned, sending a shower of ice and rock tumbling down. The sleeper was rising. The town, its prison, was shattering. There was no time to hesitate. One by one, they descended into the frigid, echoing darkness, the entrance collapsing behind them with a final, ominous roar, sealing them inside the earth, with the furious, awakened sleeper now fully unleashed upon the world above. The roar of collapsing earth deafened them, a final guttural scream from the world above. Dust, thick and suffocating, choked their lungs, coating their desperate gasps with the taste of pulverized rock and ancient dread. The air, already frigid, now felt like a lead blanket, pressing in from all sides. Darkness, absolute and consuming, swallowed the last vestiges of light, plunging them into a void where only the ragged rhythm of their own terrified heartbeats existed. David fumbled for his tactical flashlight, its beam a meager defiance against the encroaching nothingness. It cut through the swirling dust, revealing a scene of utter confinement. Massive boulders, jagged and cruel, now formed an impassable wall where the entrance had been. "We're trapped?" Jessica whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound that barely broke the heavy silence. Her face, illuminated by David's shaky light, was ashen, eyes wide with the terror that mirrored their own. Emily, ever the pragmatist, coughed, waving a hand in front of her face. "No time for that, Jessica. We knew the risks. Focus. We have to keep moving." Her voice, though strained, carried a surprising steel, a will forged in the fires of academic rigor and now tested by primal fear. Michael, surprisingly calm, checked his pack. "Good. At least the comms are still dead. No more static to drive us crazy." He tried for a joke, but it fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere. The truth was, being cut off felt less like liberation and more like an abandonment. The air here was different. It wasn't just cold. It was old, heavy with a scent that was both mineral and something else, something organic yet utterly alien, like forgotten oceans and petrified dreams. As the dust settled, the beam of David's flashlight began to reveal the true nature of their prison. This was no ordinary cave. The walls weren't rough-hewn rock. They pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow, a sickly green light emanating from strange, crystalline formations that seemed to grow directly from the stone. Veins of something dark and viscous snaked through them, like frozen blood vessels in a colossal slumbering beast. What is this place?" Jessica breathed, her hand instinctively reaching for Michael's arm. Emily's eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were wide with a mixture of awe and profound unease. "It's biogenic, or something mimicking it. These formations, they're unlike anything I've ever seen. It's almost as if the rock itself is alive, or has been shaped by something living." As they moved deeper, the passage narrowed, then opened into vast, echoing caverns. The ground underfoot was slick, uneven, covered in a fine, shimmering dust that seemed to absorb the light, making their path treacherous. The temperature dropped further, a penetrating cold that seeped into their bones, promising hypothermia. But it was more than just the cold. It was a suffocating sense of presence. Whispers began. Not audible words, not yet, but a feeling of voices, just at the edge of hearing, like 1,000 silent screams vibrating in the very air. They were insidious, burrowing into the quiet corners of their minds, seeking out their deepest anxieties. David found himself replaying the image of Oakhaven, buried under snow, his friends and neighbors lost. Emily saw equations dissolve into meaningless symbols, her life's work becoming a cruel jest. Michael saw his empty store, his family's legacy reduced to rubble. Jessica saw her parents' faces, filled with concern, then fading into accusation. "Did you hear that?" Jessica clutched her head, her face contorted. "Someone's calling my name." "No one's calling your name, Jessica," David said, his voice firm, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. He knew what this was. The sleeper. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was a psychic predator, feeding on their fear, twisting their perceptions. Don't listen to it. But it was hard not to listen. The whispers intensified, becoming more distinct, more personal. David heard his own failures, the lives he hadn't saved, the mistakes he'd made. He saw a flicker in the periphery of his vision. A shadow, darting between the strange glowing crystals, too fast to be real, too vivid to be ignored. "Keep your lights focused forward," Emily commanded, her voice cracking slightly. "Don't let your eyes drift. Visual anomalies are common in high-stress, isolated environments. It's just our minds playing tricks." But even as she said it, a tremor ran through her. Her own mind was showing her complex biological structures, intricate patterns, but instead of understanding, they dissolved into grotesque, writhing forms, mocking her desire for knowledge. They pressed on, driven by a desperate urgency. Their mission was clear: reach the core chamber, activate the containment device, and reseal the sleeper. But every step felt like wading through thick mud, every breath a struggle against an invisible weight. The passages twisted and turned, seeming to defy logic, as if the very architecture of the earth was being manipulated around them. Sometimes a path they had just taken would seem to vanish, replaced by a solid wall of glowing rock. Other times, new routes would open, beckoning them deeper into the labyrinth. "This isn't right," Michael muttered, bumping into David. "We've been through this section before. I recognize that cluster of crystals." He pointed to a particularly gnarled formation that resembled a giant, petrified hand. David shone his light around, his brow furrowed. "You're right. We have. It's looping us." A cold dread seeped into them. The sleeper wasn't just attacking their minds. It was actively shaping their environment, turning their desperate journey into an eternal, inescapable maze. Panic began to bubble. No, it's an illusion," Emily insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. She pulled out a small, rugged device from her pack, a portable scanner. She activated it, and a low hum filled the air. The screen flickered, displaying erratic readings. Gravitational anomalies. Spatial distortions. It's bending reality. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to vibrate, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very core of the earth. The glowing crystals on the walls intensified their light, pulsing with an alarming rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and distorted into monstrous shapes. The whispers escalated into a cacophony, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, not words but pure, raw emotion: fear, despair, ancient hunger. David felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the chaos. No one was there. He knew it was the sleeper, but the visceral sensation was so real, so terrifying. Jessica screamed. "Look!" She pointed a trembling finger into the cavern ahead. Through the swirling green light and the oppressive darkness, a shape began to coalesce. It was vast, indistinct, yet undeniably there. Not a physical being, not in the way they understood it, but a towering mass of shifting shadows and pulsating light, a vortex of pure energy and malevolent consciousness. It seemed to absorb the light from David's flashlight, drawing it into its formless depths. It wasn't moving, yet it felt as if it were expanding, filling the entire cavern, pressing down on them with an unimaginable weight. It's showing itself, Emily gasped, her scientific detachment finally crumbling into raw terror. This is it. The core of its influence. The air grew impossibly cold, then impossibly hot, then cold again, a rapid, disorienting fluctuation that stole their breath. The ground bucked violently, throwing them off their feet. They scrambled, trying to regain their balance amidst the chaos. The sleeper, or whatever manifestation of it stood before them, began to emit a low, guttural sound, not a roar, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through their very bones, threatening to tear them apart from the inside. Visions flooded their minds, not whispers now, but full-blown hallucinations. David saw Oakhaven not just buried but consumed, the snow melting away to reveal a skeletal landscape, the faces of its inhabitants contorted in silent agony, their eyes fixed on him accusing. Emily saw the universe itself collapsing, all knowledge and order dissolving into chaos, her life's pursuit of understanding a futile, pathetic endeavor. Michael saw his family, trapped in the blizzard, calling out for him, their voices fading into the blizzard's howl as he stood helpless. Jessica saw herself, alone in the dark, forever, tiny and insignificant, screaming into a void that echoed back only her own terror. The sleeper was trying to break them, to shatter their minds before they could even reach their objective. It was a test, a final desperate assault on their sanity. But even amidst the overwhelming horror, a flicker of defiance ignited within David. He remembered the faces of the missing, the desperate hope in the eyes of the survivors above ground. He remembered why they had come down here, into this living nightmare. No, David roared, his voice raw, fueled by a primal surge of adrenaline and stubborn resolve. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his knee, ignoring the terrifying visions. It won't break us. We have to keep going. He turned to his companions, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination that cut through the sleeper's mental assault, if only for a moment. Emily was struggling, clutching her head, but her eyes, though wide with fear, still held a spark of resolve. Michael was gritting his teeth, his face pale but set. Jessica, though sobbing, was slowly pushing herself up, her gaze fixed on David, drawing strength from his unwavering will. The device! David yelled over the cacophony, pointing deeper into the swirling vortex of the sleeper's core. We have to get to the activation point. Now! With a renewed, desperate burst of energy, they pushed forward, a tiny beacon of humanity against an ancient, cosmic horror. The sleeper's formless manifestation pulsed, its silent roar threatening to engulf them, but they pressed on, each step a testament to their unbreakable will, a desperate, defiant march into the very heart of the abyss, knowing that the survival of Oakhaven, and perhaps even more, rested on their shoulders. The true battle for their minds and for the world had just begun. The true battle for their minds and for the world had just begun. The wind howled a primeval song, a chilling symphony that seemed to vibrate not just the air, but the very bones of the survivors. Each step through the waist-deep snow was a grueling test of will, a fight against an enemy that clawed at their lungs with icy talons and whispered insidious doubts into their minds. Michael led the charge, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes scanning the swirling white for any sign of the abandoned Blackwood research station, the rumored nexus of Oakhaven's forgotten history, now their only hope. Jessica, ever vigilant, kept pace beside him, her rifle clutched tight, her gaze darting between the treacherous terrain and the faces of their dwindling group. David, pale and trembling, walked with an almost trance-like focus, his senses seemingly overwhelmed by the unseen currents of the blizzard, while Emily, huddled between two burly townsmen, shivered not just from the cold, but from a fear that seemed to emanate from within the very storm itself. Hours bled into an eternity. The relentless cold began to numb not just their extremities, but their resolve. The air, thick with ice crystals, felt heavy, almost sentient, pressing down on them, trying to crush their spirit. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, like flakes of snow brushing against their ears, they grew into distinct, venomous suggestions. Michael heard his father's disappointed voice, accusing him of weakness, of leading good people to their deaths. Jessica saw flashes of her own failures, moments where her instincts had been wrong, where lives had been lost, and felt a suffocating guilt that threatened to buckle her knees. David, always the quiet observer, found his mind flooded with a cacophony of voices, 1,000 conflicting thoughts and emotions that weren't his own, a chorus of despair and paranoia that made his head throb. Even Emily, sheltered by the adults, heard a child sobbing, calling her name from the snowdrifts, a sound that twisted her young heart with an unbearable loneliness. They pressed on, their silence broken only by the crunch of snow and the ragged gasps for air. The mental assaults intensified, personalized and relentless. The entity, whatever it was, knew their fears, their regrets, their deepest insecurities, and it wielded them like sharpened blades. One man, a burly logger named Frank, suddenly stumbled, clutching his head, screaming about spiders crawling beneath his skin. It took 3 others to hold him down, to remind him it wasn't real, to drag him forward, his sanity teetering on the edge. "It's trying to break us," Michael yelled over the wind, his voice hoarse. "Don't listen. It's not real." Jessica, her jaw tight, pointed a gloved finger. "Look!" Through a momentary lull in the whiteout, a dark angular silhouette emerged from the swirling snow. A brutalist concrete structure, half buried, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the blizzard. The Blackwood Research Station. A wave of both relief and dread washed over them. Relief that they had reached their destination, dread for what lay within. The entrance was a heavy, blast-proof door, partially obscured by snowdrifts. It took all of their combined strength, and a few well-aimed shots from Jessica's rifle at the rusted hinges, to force it open with a groan that echoed like a dying beast. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of ozone and decay, a stark contrast to the raging tempest outside. The silence was almost as deafening as the blizzard, but it was a silence that hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a subtle pressure against their eardrums. They moved stealthily through the dark, abandoned corridors, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. The facility was a maze of rusted equipment, shattered glass, and peeling paint, a testament to a hasty evacuation or a sudden catastrophic end. Rooms dedicated to atmospheric pressure analysis, geological core sampling, and electromagnetic field studies lay ransacked, their secrets scattered across dusty floors. It was clear that whatever research had been conducted here, it had been ambitious, perhaps even dangerous. As they delved deeper, the humming intensified, a low thrum that resonated in their chests, a physical manifestation of the entity's presence. The whispers returned, clearer now, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of their thoughts. They weren't just doubts anymore. They were commands, suggestions of surrender, promises of peace if they would just let go. Michael found himself wrestling with a powerful urge to simply sit down, to close his eyes and let the warmth of oblivion take him. Jessica saw her mother's face, smiling, beckoning her to a safe, sunlit home, a world away from the cold and the fear. David felt an overwhelming intellectual curiosity, a desire to understand, to merge with the source of the hum, to become part of its vast intelligence. Emily, lost in the shadows, was gripped by a sudden irrational terror of being left alone, an urge to run and hide. "We need to stick together," Michael gasped, his voice strained, fighting the lethargy creeping into his limbs. He gripped Jessica's shoulder, forcing himself to focus. "It's trying to isolate us, to pick us off one by one." They found the source of the humming in a vast circular chamber at the very heart of the facility, deep beneath the mountain. It was an impossible sight, a spectacle of alien beauty and terrifying power. In the center of the room, encased within a massive, shattered containment field, was a colossal crystalline structure, pulsating with an ethereal blue light. It wasn't a single crystal, but a complex fractal growth, thousands of razor-sharp facets constantly shifting, rearranging, each one reflecting a distorted image of their own terrified faces. The humming originated from it, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the very bedrock, filling the chamber with an almost unbearable pressure. But it wasn't just the crystal. Embedded within its glowing depths, or perhaps feeding off its energy, were remnants of human technology, wires, circuit boards, glowing digital displays, all fused into the organic structure in a grotesque, impossible union. It was as if the crystal had grown around or absorbed some ancient, powerful device. As they stared, mesmerized and horrified, the mental assault reached a fever pitch. The whispers became a roar, 1,000 voices screaming in their heads, each one their own. Michael saw Oakhaven burning, its citizens consumed by the blizzard, his failure etched onto the landscape. Jessica felt the cold grip of death, not just her own, but the death of everything she had fought for. David's mind was overwhelmed by an influx of raw data, images, and concepts that threatened to shatter his sanity. A panoramic view of the world, seen through an alien lens, a vision of consciousness spreading like a virus. "What is this?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum, her rifle now uselessly clutched. David, eyes wide and unfocused, stumbled forward, drawn by an irresistible force. It's a resonance chamber," he stammered, his words slurred. "Amplifying. A signal. An intelligence. They were trying to communicate. To control. But it took over." He pointed a trembling finger at the fusion of crystal and tech. "It's not just a signal. It's a consciousness. Ancient. Dormant. The blizzard. It didn't just awaken it. Fed it. The electromagnetic static, the extreme cold. It's the perfect medium for its expansion." As he spoke, the crystalline structure pulsed brighter, faster, and within its depths, they began to discern faint, swirling patterns of light that seemed to coalesce into crude, symbolic shapes. They weren't just random formations. They were glyphs, ancient, primal, yet strangely familiar. And then, a horrifying realization dawned upon Michael. These weren't just symbols, they were memories. Fragments of Oakhaven's history, of the townsfolk's lives, projected and distorted within the crystal's facets. It was absorbing them, consuming their experiences, their very essence. The entity wasn't just controlling minds, it was devouring them. It was a parasitic intelligence feeding on consciousness, growing stronger with each assimilated thought, each stolen memory. The blizzard was its tool, its veil, its amplifier. Oakhaven was merely its first full meal, a testing ground before it spread its tendrils across the world. A chilling alien voice, not heard with their ears but felt directly in their minds, resonated through the chamber, cutting through the cacophony of their fears. It was the voice of the crystal, the voice of the ancient intelligence, a voice that was legion, a voice that was them. "You are delicious," it hummed, each word a spike of ice in their brains. "Such rich experiences, such vibrant despair. You will make a fine addition." The air crackled with energy, the blue light intensified, and the floor beneath them began to vibrate violently. The entity was preparing to fully assimilate them, to add their minds to its vast, growing consciousness. They had found the heart of the abyss, but they were not just standing before an ancient evil. They were standing on the precipice of their own extinction, their minds the next course for a predator that had slept for centuries, now fully awake and ravenous. Their battle for Oakhaven, for their minds, had become a desperate, last-ditch stand against an intelligence that sought to consume all. The last vestiges of hope flickered, dying embers in a storm of psychic predation. Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily stood not just against an ancient evil, but against the very unraveling of their own consciousness. The entity, now fully manifest in their shared mental space, was a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers, its tendrils probing, seeking purchase, threatening to tear away the very fabric of their identities. Its voice, a chorus of forgotten screams and icy laughter, echoed in their minds, promising an end to their futile resistance, an end to their pain as it consumed them whole. It showed them visions, their deepest fears made real, their loved ones twisting into grotesque parodies, Oakhaven itself dissolving into a desolate wasteland under an eternal, suffocating white. It was a psychological assault, relentless and perfectly tailored to each of them. Michael saw himself failing, Oakhaven crumbling, his own hands stained with the blood of those he couldn't save. Jessica felt the icy grip of isolation, the crushing weight of being utterly alone in a world gone mad. David was haunted by the faces of his family, distorted and accusing, blaming him for the scientific curiosity that had perhaps unleashed this horror. Emily was assailed by a cacophony of voices, a torrent of chaotic thoughts that threatened to shatter her fragile connection to reality, to silence her unique gift forever. But amidst the terror, a strange clarity began to emerge. It was Emily, her eyes wide, unfocused, yet seeing something beyond the entity's illusions. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming words only she could hear, or perhaps, only the entity was meant to hear. It was a name, a sound, a frequency. David, despite the mental onslaught, felt a spark of recognition. The patterns Emily was unconsciously tracing, the vibrations she was emitting, they weren't random. They echoed the very data he'd painstakingly collected, the anomalies he'd theorized about. The entity, in its arrogance, had shown them too much, revealed too much of its own nature in its attempt to overwhelm them. It was a being of pure thought, yes, but thought that vibrated, that resonated, that had a specific signature. "It feeds on fear," Michael rasped, his voice barely audible, but his mind shouting the truth. "But it is fear. It's a reflection. Jessica, tears streaming down her face, found a flicker of defiance. It wants us to give up. It wants us to believe it's invincible. A chilling laugh echoed in their minds, the entity seemingly amused by their feeble attempts at understanding. You grasp at straws, little insects. Your resistance is delightful but ultimately meaningless. No, Emily whispered, her voice surprisingly clear, cutting through the mental static. You are not invincible. You are broken. You are incomplete. The entity's amusement vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring silence in their shared mental space. It was a momentary crack in its facade, a ripple in the overwhelming psychic pressure. David seized the opportunity. It's a resonance entity, he muttered, pulling a small, modified device from his pocket, the one he'd been tinkering with. It wasn't designed for this, not directly, but it was capable of emitting specific frequencies. He'd built it to study the strange energy fluctuations in Oakhaven, not to fight a sentient blizzard. It amplifies its own thought patterns, its own frequency to drown out ours. If we can disrupt that frequency, we have to fight back, not with fear, but with something else, Jessica urged, looking at Michael. What's the opposite of its despair? Michael looked at the faces of his friends, scarred but resolute. He thought of Oakhaven, not as it was now, buried and dying, but as it had been. A community flawed but resilient, full of life, laughter, and shared struggles. He thought of the simple acts of kindness, the unspoken bonds, the collective spirit that had always defined their town, even in its quiet isolation. Hope, Michael said, his voice gaining strength. Unity. He reached out, not physically but mentally, to Jessica, to David, to Emily. He projected every memory of warmth, every moment of connection, every shared dream for a future Oakhaven, even a future beyond Oakhaven. Jessica joined him, her mind flooding with images of her family, her art, the beauty she found even in the harshest winters. David, putting aside his scientific detachment, focused on the intellectual thrill of discovery, the pure joy of understanding, the belief in human ingenuity. And Emily, the conduit, the most sensitive of them all, focused her unique abilities. She wasn't just receiving thoughts, she was learning to transmit. She didn't fight the entity's frequency directly. Instead, she began to overlay it, to introduce a counter-frequency, a dissonant chord in its symphony of despair. She amplified the collective hope, the unity, the sheer stubborn will to exist that emanated from Michael, Jessica, and David. The entity recoiled. Its form flickered, the shadows wavering, its whispers turning into a high-pitched shriek that was more pain than malice. It was being overwhelmed, not by brute force, but by something it couldn't comprehend, something inherently alien to its nature. The collective, unyielding spirit of humanity. It had sought to consume their minds, but in doing so, it had inadvertently exposed itself to the very thing that could unravel it. David, with trembling hands, activated his device. It hummed a low, almost imperceptible thrum that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in their very bones. It wasn't a weapon, but a disruptor, designed to interfere with anomalous energy fields. He aimed it, not at a physical target, but at the psychic epicenter of the entity's presence. The device, resonating with Emily's focused will and the combined mental strength of the others, began to emit a precise, disruptive frequency that mirrored the entity's own, but inverted, an anti-pattern. The blizzard outside, which had been a deafening roar, began to diminish, its intensity faltering. The pressure in their minds lessened, the crushing weight lifting. The entity's form, once a terrifying vortex, now looked like a struggling phantom, battling against an unseen force. Its screams grew more desperate, more primal, less like a predator and more like a creature in agony. Impossible! It shrieked, its voice splitting into 1,000 echoes of rage and fear. You are nothing. We are Oakhaven, Michael declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority, his mind a fortress of resolve. And we will not be buried alive. The entity thrashed, its tendrils lashing out, but they no longer found purchase. The shared mental space, once its domain, was now a battleground where its own internal consistency was being torn apart. The snow outside the windows began to fall differently, no longer a furious assault, but a gentler, almost tired descent. The wind howled, but with less malice, more like a lament. Then, with a final ear-splitting psychic scream that seemed to tear at the very fabric of their sanity, the entity imploded. It didn't vanish. It unraveled. The shadows pulled back, the whispers died, the crushing pressure simply ceased. It was as if a vast, terrible emptiness had been suddenly filled, leaving behind only a profound, ringing silence. The blizzard, as if on cue, began to break. Slowly, painfully, Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily returned to their own minds, to the cold, stark reality of the community center. The hum of David's device faded, its purpose fulfilled. Exhaustion, bone-deep and overwhelming, washed over them. They collapsed, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling from the ordeal. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, a soft, ethereal light filtering through the thinning clouds. The snow had stopped. Oakhaven was still buried, but it was no longer under siege. The air, though frigid, felt clean, scrubbed of the oppressive, unseen presence that had suffocated them for days. Rescue teams arrived hours later, digging through drifts that towered over the buildings. They found the survivors huddled, gaunt but alive. The stories they told were fragmented, disbelieved, and quickly attributed to the trauma of being trapped in an unprecedented blizzard. Tales of a conscious entity, a predator of the mind, were gently dismissed as shared hallucinations brought on by fear and isolation. But the people of Oakhaven knew. Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily especially carried the weight of what they had faced. They looked at each other with a silent understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of unimaginable terror. They had survived, but they were changed. The town itself was changed. The blizzard that had buried Oakhaven alive had done more than just pile snow. It had peeled back a layer of reality, revealing a darkness that had slumbered beneath the earth for centuries, waiting for the perfect storm, the perfect isolation, to awaken. Oakhaven rebuilt. The snow eventually melted, revealing the scars on the land and the houses. Life went on, but a subtle shift had occurred. People were quicker to help their neighbors, more appreciative of human connection, more wary of the long, dark nights of winter. They spoke of the blizzard of '23 with hushed tones, remembering the relentless cold, the isolation, the strange, unsettling dreams. But no one spoke of the entity, not out loud. Yet sometimes, in the deepest silence of a winter night, or in the sudden, inexplicable chill that would sometimes sweep through a room, a faint whisper could almost be heard, a tremor of an ancient, defeated consciousness. Was it truly gone? Or merely driven back, banished to its icy slumber, waiting once more for the perfect conditions, the perfect storm to rise again? Oakhaven had survived the blizzard that buried it alive, but the memory of what had lurked beneath the snow, what had sought to consume their very minds, would forever remain a chilling, unspoken truth, a silent sentinel in the heart of their quiet, resilient town. And as the years passed, some would wonder, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, if it had truly been buried or merely waiting.